Hi, I'm Tinbit Ermias, and this is NPR's Book of the Day. Larry Bird is a colossal figure in basketball, easily one of the most recognizable people in the modern history of that sport. But it wasn't always that way. In his new book, Heartland, A Forgotten Place, An Impossible Dream, and the Miracle of Larry Bird, writer Keith O'Brien tells the story of Bird's early life, what motivated him to start playing basketball, and what he's up to these days. Here's O'Brien talking about the basketball legend with Weekend Edition host Scott Simon.
This message comes from Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. This message comes from MIDI Health. Introducing AgeWell, longevity care designed by women for women. Whether you're looking to prevent future health issues or just feel more like yourself, learn more at joinmidi.com. That's joinmidi.com.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Carvana. Your time is worth more than a waiting game. Carvana gives you a transparent offer for your car in minutes and picks it up from your door. Sell your car today at Carvana.com. Pickup fees may apply.
You know, these days, if there's a talented high school basketball player in Croatia or Congo, recruiters will find them and may sign them to a college career that lasts just a year, one and done, on their way to the pros, along with a multi-million-dollar NIL or name, image, and likeness deal, every moment passed along on social media. Then there's the story of Larry Bird, one of the greatest players in the history of the game, gave it up when he left Indiana University in 1974 to work on a garbage truck in his hometown of French Lick, Indiana. The story of his return and rise into sports history is told in Keith O'Brien's new book, Heartland, A Forgotten Place, An Impossible Dream, and The Miracle of Larry Bird. Keith O'Brien, the best-selling author of Charlie Hustle, Outside Shot, and other books, joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
And we will caution that this discussion may include mention of self-harm. You read about Larry Bird's childhood. Do you begin to understand why he spent so much time on a basketball court?
Yeah, you know, this story is a bit different, right? We always do the Bird magic thing, where we combine the narratives of Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. And really what I wanted to do with this book was just tilt the camera a little bit differently, change that perspective and zoom in on that origin story in rural Indiana in the 1970s.
At the center of it is the tragedy of Larry Bird's father. What should we know about Joey Bird?
You know, Joey was a present father in the life of Larry Bird, but he did have struggles. He struggled to stay employed. He struggled with drinking. Based on my reporting, those struggles really do date back to the Korean War. And in the winter of 1950, 1951, Joey Bird is in the thick of the fight. Joey Bird sees and maybe does terrible things that winter. And, you know, those struggles by the early 1970s are going to lead to a divorce. And sadly and tragically, he does take his own life at a time when Larry Bird is only 18 years old, and he's a kid who's in the midst of his own struggles. You know, that's the winter after Larry Bird has left Indiana. After just 3 weeks, he's walked away from a scholarship from the great Bobby Knight at Indiana University. He's returned to French Lick, and he is nearly slipping away, really drifting to the edges of the basketball map.
Did basketball also bring him back?
It did. Larry is playing in what's known as the Industrial League. These are teams that were sponsored by taverns and liquor stores. Larry is playing with guys who are 8, 10 years older than him. And then, you know, out of nowhere, a man named Bill Hodges, a sort of journeyman, down on his luck, assistant coach, newly hired at Indiana State, you know, drifts down to French Lick, driving the streets, looking for, as he said, a 6'7" blonde kid.
We should explain, Indiana State, unlike Indiana University, not a powerhouse.
Not a powerhouse. This was a school that was teetering on the brink of being banished to Division II. It's more of a working class school. And actually, that's one reason why it works for Larry. He feels comfortable there. But when that spotlight finds him, and the national media comes calling, they do want to write this epic story. They want to know about his childhood, much to Larry's chagrin.
Can you tell us your name, although I don't think we need to ask?
Larry Bird.
Larry Bird. And you're from French Lick, Indiana.
You said it all when you said it.
Yeah, you did.
One of our producers found this clip of Larry Bird as a college star at Indiana State. This was on WTHI TV in Terre Haute.
Okay, and what first got you interested in basketball?
Girls.
Girls? Because you found that the girls like basketball players?
No, they played with us, and that's all we had to play with, because down French Lick, not very many people play, so we got a bunch of girls up and just got interested in it.
Let me ask you about what I'll call Larry Bird's verbal style with reporters. You didn't like him, did he?
He sure didn't. People who dug too deep. People who, as Larry said in the 1970s, wanted to talk to him about things that, quote, didn't pertain to basketball. He didn't like that at all.
Let me ask you about a signature appearance, though. When Larry Bird won Player of the Year trophy in 1979, the ceremonies in Chicago, what did he say?
At that ceremony, they want to talk to him about, his career, but they also want to talk to him about something that Larry is really uncomfortable in discussing, and that's his race, his whiteness. At the time in the late 70s, NBA executives and television executives, spoke about his race out loud. As one general manager in the NBA says, Larry Bird's a, quote, unusual commodity, and as a result, he's going to make more money. And they called him out loud the Great White Hope. And, at that, ceremony, after he's accepted that award, they press him on that. What does that mean to him? And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he knows what people expect of him. He knows what people are saying about him. He would do his best to prove that he was worthy even just to play in the NBA. Larry would happily later, especially with the Celtics, talk about the game, the pass, the final play, the strategy. He didn't even then like to talk about what was going on off the court. And here he is now in 1979 at a moment when he really doesn't like to talk to the media, being forced to answer questions about racial politics. It was hard for him.
We will note Indiana State went 33-1 in 1979. The finals, of course, Indiana State versus Michigan State, Bird versus Magic.
Perhaps we've never seen a final game with two greater individual players than Larry Bird, the Player of the Year from Indiana State, and the Magic Man from East Lansing, Irvin Johnson.
50 million people watched that game. How did it change the game of basketball in America?
Well, it's certainly one of the sparks for March Madness. This was a time when there were 4 networks. People were glued to their television sets on that Monday night in late March. It fundamentally changes Larry Bird's life. It fundamentally changes Magic Johnson's life. It changes the NBA. We know what happens to Bird. We know what happens to Magic. But his college roommate, a man named Bob Heaton, his other teammates, Bill Hodges himself, the coach who had saved Larry, all of them are forever changed by this moment. And that, to me, makes it more than a sports story. It is a grand American epic.
Larry Bird's a happy farmer today?
50 years ago, like we said, Larry wanted to disappear. And in some ways, today, he has finally pulled that off. He is a father. He is a grandfather. He spends his winters down south. He spends his summers up north, back in Indiana on a sprawling ranch. I've been told by people who've been to that ranch, who've spent summer days there, that when Larry gets to that ranch, he's happy going the entire summer, not even leaving the property.
Keith O'Brien, his new book, Heartland, A Forgotten Place, An Impossible Dream, and the Miracle of Larry Bird. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
Now we don't know a thing about what the future will bring, but for now we're going to spread the word.
This message comes from Capella University. That spark you feel? That's your drive for more. Capella University's FlexPath learning format lets you earn your degree at your pace without putting life on pause. Learn more at capella.edu.
Do you ever wish you could predict the future? Well, some scientists try to do that every year, forecasting when cherry blossom trees will bloom each spring.
It's a wild guess, but there is some science involved in it.
And there is a lot riding on the peak bloom forecast. Tourism, climate change models, and more. Listen to Shortwave on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcast to hear how scientists are predicting the future.